It was one of those brutal Alaskan winter nights in 1996, the kind where the cold seeps through the walls and the wind howls like a living thing. Inside the Wilsons' modest log cabin, the fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. 4-year-old Emily sat on the wide windowsill, her tiny hands pressed against the frosted glass, eyes wide with wonder. Outside, the world was buried under a thick blanket of snow, shimmering under the pale glow of the full moon. Suddenly, Emily's breath caught in her throat. Out there, just beyond the porch light, a dark shape moved across the snow. At first, she thought it was a shadow, or maybe the wind playing tricks on her tired eyes. But as it drew closer, Emily saw it. A massive figure lumbering slowly, followed by 2 smaller shapes stumbling along behind. It was a bear. No, not just any bear. A mother bear with her cubs, thin, ragged, and visibly desperate. Emily's heart pounded, not with fear, but with something else. A strange mix of awe and sympathy. She could see the mother bear hesitate at the edge of the yard, her head low, her movements slow and cautious. Emily leaned closer, her breath fogging up the window pane, and for a moment, she felt a connection, as if that creature out there, shivering under the stars, was pleading not with words, but with her eyes. What could possibly drive a wild mother bear to approach a human home in the dead of winter? And more importantly, what would happen next? Emily couldn't tear her eyes away from the window. Her little fingers trembled slightly against the cold glass as the scene outside unfolded like something out of a fairy tale, or maybe a nightmare. The mother bear stepped cautiously into the pale ring of light cast by the porch, her thick fur matted with ice and snow, ribs faintly visible under the heavy coat that should have kept her warm. Her 2 cubs, no bigger than Labradors, stumbled along behind her, their tiny legs sinking into the deep snow. Inside the cabin, Emily's parents, John and Linda Wilson, were bustling about in the kitchen preparing a late dinner. The smell of baked chicken and fresh bread filled the air, a sharp contrast to the bitter cold outside, but Emily barely noticed. Her entire world had shrunk down to the thin layer of glass separating her from the raw struggle for survival just outside. "Mommy, there's a bear." At first, Linda chuckled, thinking her daughter was just playing make-believe again, but when she came over, her face paled. "Linda, John, come here, now." John Wilson, a tall man with a weathered face and the kind of quiet strength that comes from years of Alaskan winters, walked over with a puzzled frown. But when he looked out the window, his jaw tightened. "John, that's not normal." His instincts as a former park ranger kicked in. Bears didn't approach homes, not unless they were desperate. But Emily twisted in her mother's arms, her big blue eyes shining with tears. "Emily! No, Mama, she's hungry! The baby bears are cold!" Emily's voice cracked with urgency, the kind that only a child's pure heart could hold. John looked at his daughter, then back at the scene outside. The mother bear had sat down on her haunches near the edge of the yard, her breath coming in visible puffs in the freezing air. The cubs huddled against her side, shivering. It was a sight that tugged at something deep in his chest, something beyond caution, beyond logic. Emily wriggled free and ran to the kitchen. Before her parents could stop her, she had grabbed a small wicker basket from the counter, stuffing it with apples, rolls of bread, and half a roasted chicken wrapped in foil. "John, Emily, stop!" But she was already at the door, her tiny feet scrambling to shove on her pink snow boots. By the time John reached her, Emily was standing on the porch, cheeks flushed red, arms full of the heavy basket. For a heartbeat that felt like forever, no one moved. The cold bit into Emily's skin, but her focus never wavered. She stepped carefully down the icy stairs, her breath forming little clouds in the moonlight. "Emily, come back inside!" But John raised a hand, his eyes locked on the bear. Something in that stillness told him this wasn't an attack. This was a mother, out of options. Emily reached the bottom of the stairs and set the basket down on the snow, just a few feet beyond the porch. She stood there for a moment, her small figure illuminated by the porch light, a fragile silhouette against the vast white world. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, she backed up, retreating to the safety of the porch. "She's going to get herself killed," but John shook his head slowly, eyes never leaving the bear. The mother bear rose cautiously, massive paws crunching softly on the frozen ground. She took one step, then another, ears flicking nervously, nostrils flaring as the scent of food reached her. The cubs stayed behind, watching. With agonizing slowness, the bear approached the basket. She lowered her enormous head, sniffed, then, to everyone's astonishment, let out a soft huff, almost like a sigh. Carefully, almost delicately, she took the chicken in her jaws and backed away, retreating toward her cubs. Emily clapped her hands softly, tears streaming down her cheeks, though she wasn't sure why she was crying. John exhaled, realizing only then that he'd been holding his breath. Linda slumped into a chair, covering her face with shaking hands. Outside, the mother bear nosed the food toward her cubs, who let out soft, high-pitched cries as they devoured the meal. The family watched in silence, hearts pounding, as the wild and human worlds brushed against each other in a moment so raw and pure that it would be etched into their memories forever. As the last scraps of food disappeared, the mother bear raised her head and, for a moment, looked straight at the cabin. Not a glare, not a snarl, just a quiet, heavy gaze. Then she turned, her cubs stumbling after her, and disappeared into the trees. Inside the cabin, no one spoke for a long time. The only sound was the soft crackle of the fire and Emily's quiet sniffles. John knelt down and wrapped his arms around his daughter, pulling her close. "John, V.O. You've got one brave heart, kiddo." Linda joined them, wiping her eyes, her voice shaking as she whispered, "Linda, V.O. Let's hope we did the right thing." But deep down, all three of them knew. This was just the beginning. The next morning, the Wilson cabin buzzed with uneasy silence. Emily sat at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly pushing cereal around in her bowl, while John sipped coffee by the window, eyes scanning the edge of the woods. Linda flitted between the kitchen and the living room, glancing nervously at the window every few seconds. They had barely slept. Even now, John kept expecting the bears to return, perhaps this time with less patience, driven by the lingering taste of human generosity. But it wasn't the bears that arrived first. Around mid-morning, the sound of crunching tires in the snow broke the silence. John's heart sank as he saw a familiar green pickup pull into the driveway. Earl Jennings, their nearest neighbor, bundled in a thick brown coat and a bright orange hunting cap. Earl was a good man, but he wasn't the type to overlook a bear near people's homes. And sure enough, within minutes, 3 more trucks appeared, neighbors armed with binoculars, shotguns, and worried expressions. John met them on the porch, pulling his jacket tight against the bitter wind. Earl Jennings. "You seen him, John?" Earl asked, his voice low but tense. John, "Yeah, came through last night." Earl Jennings, with a furrowed brow, muttered, "Figured as much. My dogs have been howling since midnight." "Listen, I don't want no trouble, but you got a family to think about. Bears this close to a home? That ain't right." Behind him, a cluster of neighbors murmured in agreement. John felt a cold knot form in his gut. He knew the logic. He'd preached it himself back when he was a ranger. Wild animals and people don't mix, and when they do, it usually ends with a bullet. But when he looked back at his little girl peeking out the window, wide-eyed and pale-faced, something inside him twisted. With a firm voice, John said, "I called Fish and Game this morning. They're sending someone out. Let's hold off for now." Earl Jennings glanced back at the others. "You sure that's wise, John? A hungry bear's a desperate bear. Next time it might not stop at your chicken." John replied, "I'll handle it." The group lingered a while longer, muttering among themselves before reluctantly driving off. John watched them disappear down the snowy road, a heavy weight pressing on his chest. Emily ran up to John inside the cabin. "Daddy, they're not going to hurt her, are they?" Her voice was small, trembling. John responded, "I don't know, baby, but we need to be careful." That evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the bears returned. "Emily! Daddy!" Emily cried, scrambling to the window. Sure enough, there they were, the mother bear and her 2 cubs, lingering at the edge of the yard, just beyond the porch light. But this time, they weren't alone. A thin, ragged male bear had appeared, larger and rougher, hanging back near the tree line. John's stomach tightened. A lone male, that complicated everything. "Linda, John, we can't keep doing this." He knew she was right. Feeding wild animals was dangerous, no matter how pure the intention, and now, with a male in the mix, the situation had shifted from heartwarming to potentially lethal. Emily tugged at John's sleeve, her voice soft but insistent. "Daddy, please, they're hungry." John rubbed a hand over his face, the roughness of his stubble scraping his palm. Every instinct screamed at him to keep his family safe, to scare off the bears, to call the authorities, to shut this down before someone got hurt. But then he looked down at his daughter, saw the pleading in her eyes, the hope, the fierce little heart that refused to turn away from suffering. With a heavy sigh, John grabbed the basket from the kitchen counter, filling it with whatever scraps they could spare: apples, carrots, leftover stew in a covered dish. As he stepped onto the porch, Linda hovered at the door, worry etched deep in her brow. "Linda, be careful." "John, I will." The air was razor-sharp cold, the snow crunching beneath his boots. He walked slowly, deliberately, setting the basket just beyond the steps. The mother bear shifted, muscles tensing, but she held her ground. The cubs whimpered again, and the male let out a low, guttural sound from the shadows. John raised his hands, palms out, and backed away. Inside, Emily pressed her nose to the glass, watching every move. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, cautiously, the mother bear approached. She sniffed the basket, nudged it open, and began pulling out the food. The cubs joined her, their small bodies quivering with excitement. The male lingered at the edge, watching, waiting. John let out a shaky breath and stepped back inside. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind tapping against the window, sent shivers of fear down their spines. What if the bears tried to break in? What if the male turned aggressive? What if the neighbors came back, guns in hand? Around 2 a.m., John slipped out of bed and sat by the window, a mug of coffee warming his hands. The moon hung high and bright, casting long shadows across the snow. For a long time he watched the tree line, heart heavy with the impossible choice before him. Because the truth was dawning on him now. This couldn't go on. Sooner or later something would break. And in the stillness of that cold, fragile night, John realized it was time to choose between protecting his family and honoring the wild, untamed hope of his little girl. He just prayed that whatever choice he made, it wouldn't break her heart. The morning sun crept over the horizon, casting pale pink and gold across the snow-blanketed yard. Inside the cabin, John sat at the kitchen table, dark circles under his eyes, fingers wrapped tightly around a lukewarm mug of coffee. Linda moved quietly around him, packing sandwiches into Emily's school bag, though they both knew Emily wouldn't be going anywhere today. Emily herself sat cross-legged on the rug near the window, staring out with a quiet intensity far beyond her 4 years. "I called Fish and Game again. They're sending someone today." Linda, VO. "Are they going to?" John, VO. "They'll relocate them if they can, but if the male gets aggressive." Outside, faint tracks crisscrossed the yard, evidence of the night's restless visitors. But the bears were gone now, melted back into the woods. For now. Emily, VO. "They're going to help them, right, Daddy? Not hurt them?" John, VO. "They're going to try, sweetheart." Just before noon, the sound of an engine rattled up the driveway. A green Fish and Game truck pulled in, and a tall, broad-shouldered man in a heavy parka climbed out. His name was Rick Maddox. John knew him from years back when they'd worked side by side on wildlife calls. Rick, VO. "Long time, John. You've got yourself in a bit of a situation." John, VO. "Yeah, you could say that." Rick walked the property, studied the tracks, listened as John explained what had happened. Emily stayed glued to the window, her face pale and anxious. When Rick glanced toward the house, she ducked behind the curtain, clutching a worn-out stuffed bear to her chest. Rick's voice echoed in John's mind. "Look, John, I'll do everything I can to move them peacefully. But if the male charges, if he's already associating this place with food, we may not have a choice." As dusk settled, the bears returned. This time, Rick was ready, tranquilizer gun in hand, a second officer nearby. The mother bear and cubs emerged first, noses lifted to the scent of dinner scraps Emily had left near the porch. But the male followed closely, more confident now, bolder, his massive head swinging from side to side as he approached. John stood on the porch, every muscle in his body coiled tight. Emily pressed her palms to the window, lips moving silently in prayer. Rick's voice was calm but firm. Easy, easy. But just as his finger tensed on the trigger, something extraordinary happened. The mother bear turned. With a low guttural growl, she spun on the male, placing herself between him and the house. The cub squealed, darting behind her. The male hesitated, then let out a roar, swiping at her with a massive paw. Snow exploded into the air. Rick shouted, "John, get inside!" But John froze, eyes wide, heart hammering, because in that moment he saw it. Not a wild, mindless beast, but a mother, fierce and determined, standing her ground to protect her young. And unbelievably, the human family that had shown her kindness. The male lunged, but the mother bear didn't back down. She charged, snapping her teeth, driving him back toward the tree line. The two massive creatures clashed in a flurry of snow and snarls, the cubs crying out from the sidelines. Emily whispered, "Please, please be okay." Rick murmured, "I've never seen anything like this." For what felt like forever, the two bears battled, until finally, the male turned and retreated, crashing into the woods with an angry bellow. The mother bear stood trembling in the clearing, sides heaving, watching until she was sure he was gone. Then, slowly, she turned back toward the cabin. For a heartbeat their eyes met, wild and human, predator and protector. And in that fragile instant John felt a swell of emotion that stole his breath away. "Rick, Vio, we'll help her." That night, as the mother and cubs were safely tranquilized and prepared for relocation, John lifted Emily into his arms, holding her close as tears rolled down her cheeks. "John, Vio, you did it, baby, you helped save them." Emily, Vio, "I just wanted her to be okay, Daddy." John, Vio, "She is, sweetheart, thanks to you." Outside, under the vast star-sprinkled sky, the last traces of the bears faded into the night, leaving behind a family forever changed. And a little girl whose heart had bridged the wild and the human with nothing but courage and love. The night after the relocation, the Wilson cabin sat unusually quiet. Snow drifted softly under the glow of the porch light, the world outside blanketed in a fragile stillness. Inside, John tucked Emily into bed, brushing a curl of blonde hair from her forehead. She clutched her worn stuffed bear tightly, her eyes heavy but restless. Emily, Vio, "Daddy, do you think they're okay?" John, Vio, "Yes, sweetheart. Rick's team will take them somewhere safe, a place with plenty of food away from people. They'll be just fine." Emily, Vio, "Will we ever see them again?" John, Vio, "Maybe, but even if we don't, they'll remember, and so will we." As Emily drifted into sleep, John sat by her for a long moment, watching the soft rise and fall of her breath, feeling the weight of everything that had unfolded over the past few days. Then he slipped downstairs where Linda was waiting in the kitchen with 2 steaming mugs of tea. Linda, Vo, "She okay?" John, Vio, "Yeah, she's okay." They sat together at the kitchen table sipping tea in silence. The events of the past week hung heavy between them, the bears, the neighbors, the raw fear, and the moments of astonishing beauty that had cracked open something deep in all of them. But just as they were beginning to feel the tension drain from their shoulders, the phone rang. John's stomach dropped. He crossed the room quickly, snatching up the receiver. The male bear hadn't gone far. After the mother and cubs were tranquilized and moved to the sanctuary, Rick's team had stayed behind to monitor the area. But the male had circled back, now emboldened and increasingly aggressive. Without the mother bear's presence to keep him in check, he'd begun wandering closer to homes, digging through garbage bins and snarling at residents. "He's associating your house with food, and now that the family's gone, he's looking for an easy meal. We're going to try and dart him, relocate him farther north. But John, if he charges, we can't risk the team." John felt cold seep into his bones. This was the nightmare he'd been trying to avoid, the inevitable price of stepping too close to the wild. That night, John sat in the darkened living room, the rifle he never thought he'd use again resting across his knees. He stared out the window, his face set in grim determination. Linda sat nearby, silent, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a cup of cold tea. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, swirling in thick, blinding sheets, and somewhere in that blizzard, a shadow moved. "Daddy, is he back?" John, Vio, "Go back to bed, baby, everything's going to be okay." "Don't hurt him, Daddy, please." Narrator, VO. For a moment, all his resolve crumbled. But then, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the snow snapped him back. Linda, take her upstairs, now. Narrator, VO. The male bear emerged from the storm like a ghost. Massive, dark, and restless. His breath steamed in the freezing air, his eyes glinting as he prowled just beyond the edge of the porch light. John stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, heart pounding so loudly he thought it might crack his ribs. Behind him, Linda watched through the window, one arm wrapped tightly around Emily, who was sobbing softly against her chest. For a long moment, man and beast stared at each other across the snowy yard, a standoff between instinct and conscience. John raised the rifle slowly, his finger hovered over the trigger, but then, something shifted. The bear paused, lifting his massive head, nostrils flaring. And for the first time since this had all begun, John didn't see a threat. He saw hunger, exhaustion, a creature lost and out of place. He remembered Emily's voice, trembling with fierce, innocent compassion. "Please don't hurt him, Daddy." His finger slipped from the trigger, he lowered the rifle. John's voice echoed in his mind. "Hold your fire, give him a chance." Rick approached carefully, raising the dart gun. The bear let out a low, frustrated growl, pawing at the snow, but his energy was fading. When the dart hit, the animal staggered, shook his massive head, then slowly collapsed into the snow with a deep, rumbling sigh. John exhaled, shoulders sagging with relief. Inside the cabin, Emily watched, her face pressed to the window, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. But this time, they were tears of gratitude. Later that night, when the last truck pulled away and the male bear was safely on his way north, John sat alone on the porch, the cold biting at his skin. Linda came out, a blanket draped over her shoulders. Linda's voice echoed in his mind. "You did good, John." John thought to himself, I couldn't let it end like that. Linda's words resonated with John. "You chose compassion, just like Emily." John nodded, reflecting, "Yeah, she taught me more in a week than I learned in a lifetime." Above them, the stars blazed in the clear winter sky, and for the first time in days, the world was silent. No more restless pacing, no more low growls in the dark. Just the quiet hum of a family rediscovering its place in the delicate balance between wild and human, predator and protector. And upstairs, a little girl slept soundly, dreaming of bears, not as monsters but as fellow travelers through a world that was sometimes cold, sometimes harsh, but always capable of surprising grace.
Weeks passed and the snow began its slow retreat under the hesitant warmth of an early Alaskan spring. The days stretched a little longer, the nights softened, and the Wilson family settled back into a life that, on the surface, looked normal again. Yet something fundamental had shifted. Emily played by the window often, eyes drifting toward the tree line as if hoping to catch a familiar silhouette. She asked fewer questions now, but when she did, they carried a deeper weight. Emily, VO. "Do you think the cubs are happy, Daddy? Do you think the mommy bear misses me?" John always answered with the same quiet reassurance, though deep down, the memory of those dark eyes, wild, desperate, grateful, lingered in his mind like an echo. Then came the letter. It arrived one crisp morning, tucked among the usual bills and junk mail, its envelope marked with the emblem of the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center. Linda was the first to see it, and called John in from the yard, where he was repairing a sagging section of fence. Emily scampered behind him, curious as always. John opened the envelope carefully, scanning the neatly typed letter inside. And then slowly, a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Linda's voice echoed in his mind. "What is it, John?" "Mr. Wilson, we wanted to extend our gratitude for your extraordinary patience and cooperation during the recent wildlife incident near your home. Thanks to your efforts, we were able to successfully relocate the female bear and her cubs to a protected sanctuary near Kenai where they have adapted remarkably well. We thought you and your family might like to know, in a recent behavioral assessment, the mother bear displayed unusually low levels of aggression toward human caregivers, a rarity we attribute to the unique interaction she had at your property. We believe your family's compassion played a role in shaping her response. Enclosed, you will find a photo taken just last week. With gratitude, Rick Maddox and the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Team. John slowly pulled the enclosed photo from the envelope. There she was, the mother bear, standing tall and healthy in a sunlit meadow, thick coat gleaming, eyes alert but calm. And beside her, the two cubs tumbled over each other in a game of clumsy wrestling, their small forms blurred with motion, their little mouths wide with what could almost be described as laughter. Emily's breath caught. "Mommy, that's her." "That's right, kiddo. That's her. And look at them. They made it." Emily traced a tiny finger over the image, her face radiant with wonder. "Do you think she remembers me?" "I think some things you never forget." But the true twist came later that afternoon. John was out in the yard, finishing the last repairs to the fence, when he noticed something odd. Faint, small tracks in the soft earth near the edge of the woods. Not bear tracks, not deer. These were lighter, almost tentative. He followed them carefully, frowning, until they disappeared into the undergrowth. That evening, as dusk settled, Emily sat by the window again. The house was filled with the soft sounds of dinner preparations. Linda humming at the stove, John setting the table, when Emily let out a soft gasp. "Daddy, come look." John moved to the window, heart thumping. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a fox, lean, russet-colored, with sharp, curious eyes. Behind it, two tiny kits peeked out from the brush, their ears twitching, their small noses lifted to the air. John and Emily watched in stunned silence as the fox calmly surveyed the yard, then nudged her kits gently, disappearing into the darkening woods. "Well, looks like word's getting around. They know we're nice." And in that moment, John understood something profound. The small acts of kindness we offer ripple outward in ways we may never fully see, touching lives, human and animal alike, and sometimes returning to us in the most unexpected, beautiful ways. That night, as the Wilsons sat down to dinner, the cabin felt a little warmer, the world a little gentler. And outside, under the endless Alaskan sky, life moved forward. Wild and unpredictable, fragile and resilient, always waiting to surprise. Spring melted slowly into summer, and though the snowdrifts were gone, the memory of that winter lingered in the Wilson home like a quiet hymn. Life returned to its small, familiar routines. Emily tending a patch of wildflowers in the yard, Linda humming in the kitchen, John stacking firewood with an occasional glance toward the edge of the forest. But something inside all of them had changed. "She's different now," Linda murmured, watching Emily dance in the yard, her laughter floating through the air like a songbird's call. "We all are." For a while they sat in peaceful silence, watching their daughter spin through the golden light, and John's mind wandered. Back to the bitter cold, the dark shapes in the snow, the moment his finger hovered on the trigger, and the moment he chose to lower the gun. He thought of Rick's letter, the photo of the mother bear and her cubs, the fox at the tree line, and the simple, astonishing truth that Emily had taught him without even knowing. That courage isn't always about standing your ground. Sometimes it's about opening your heart. "Daddy, do you think the animals will come back next winter?" "Maybe, sweetheart. But even if they don't, they're always part of us now." He looked out into the dark woods, feeling a quiet awe settle into his bones. The lesson had come softly, like snowfall. A reminder that the world, though wild and unpredictable, answers kindness with its own quiet magic. In a season when the earth seemed frozen solid, a little girl's heart had warmed something untamed, and in doing so, had thawed something deep in the hearts of the people around her. As fireflies winked in the tall grass and the stars stitched themselves across the sky, the Wilsons sat wrapped in the hush of a world bigger and wilder than they had ever understood, but also, somehow, more tender. And inside that fragile balance between fear and grace, they found the truth that would stay with them forever. Sometimes the smallest hands can mend the deepest divides. If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed a moment where kindness bridged the gap between people and nature? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more stories that remind us of the quiet power of compassion.